before we begin with that, we have a few announcements. Paula?
Okay. Well, most of the announcements that I would give were in the newsletter that went out last night. Lots of water stuff going on this March, and hopefully you'll be able to enjoy a lot of them. Save the second Tuesday of April. We'll be approaching Earth Day and celebrating sort of Earth Month with, we were working on some special plans for that monthly meeting for Sustainable Tucson, and the news will go out in the newsletter. If for any reason you don't get the newsletter and want to get meeting announcements that way, you can email me at paula@sustainabletucson.org.
Okay, just wanted to say, Paula, that the UA College of Science is having a lecture series on water starting April 1st. So go to their website, and it's like 4 lectures all about water. I'm going to post it on Blog for Arizona shortly, maybe next week.
I think I saw that, and I'll add it in the upcoming newsletter.
Okay.
We're also having the series that starts on March 17th, also on water.
Right.
So
it's water time.
Water time, definitely.
Our topic tonight is sustainable housing, sustainable building. And we've all heard about LEED certification, which has to do with using as little energy as possible. And Bob and David are going to give us some insights into that and beyond that to give us a broad, wide range view of what it means to really be sustainable in our housing. There are lots of aspects, and I think you'll be interested in both the history and the culture of architecture here in Tucson, as Bob will describe it, and in the actual materials that go into buildings and how important those can be for real sustainability. Bob will be our first speaker, and he will share with us a lot of pictures and stories. He's a native Arizonan. He was born in Fort Huachuca. He's practiced architecture here in Arizona, also New Mexico, Texas, Massachusetts, for now over 34 years. He established his independent practice in 1993. His projects in Tucson have included preservation of Mission San Javier, design of the San Javier Franciscan Friary and the mission school there, Linda Ronstadt's Tucson residence. If you haven't been by there, I'm sure it'll be worth a visit. The main entrance of the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. And what a beautiful entrance that is. Preservation of the Bisbee Central School. He is in addition an assistant professor of practice at UA's School of Architecture. And he teaches a course called History and Theory of Urban Design. Some very interesting perspectives and ideas. Annually, he has a seminar on arid region urbanism with field trips. We're really glad to have you here tonight, Bob. And we're all going to be tight on the schedule. So what we ask is, if you have questions as we're going along, put them in the chat box. And we're going to focus on questions after each has had a chance to speak about 30 minutes. So type away or just write them down for yourself, and we'll have plenty of time to have our questions then. All right, Bob.
Great. Thank you, Stuart, for a nice introduction. And it's nice to be here. Reminds me of a line I heard from Arlo Guthrie when I heard him downtown at the Little Theater. He says, "It sure is nice to be here in Tucson tonight." And he said, "Of course, it's nice to be anywhere." A little wisdom from Arlo. Hey, Paul Schwam, I see some familiar faces here. So I'm going to launch into a share screen here of a presentation that I have actually based on some of my lectures that I give in the Arid Region Seminar. Okay, I'm going to fly. I've got a lot of material to share with you, but I generally move pretty quickly. So we all know where we are. We're in an arid region, one of many on Earth, and they're growing, and billions of people live in these hot, dry areas. We are, of course, denizens of the Sonoran Desert, most of which is in Sonora. The Chihuahuan Desert sneaks into southeastern Arizona, too. There's a border running through it, but of course, the climate and the culture don't even know that border exists. We do live in one of the most beautiful desert regions anywhere on Earth, I think. And yet, we have built one of the ugliest cities anywhere on Earth. One of the things that motivated me to go into architecture was growing up here in the 60s. Life magazine had an article, a big spread. Speedway's the ugliest street in America. I was like, oh, God, oh, ow, that hurts, you know? And so I wanted, you know, to help make Tucson less bad, I guess, which has been sort of my goal. And hopefully to some degree, I've helped along with lots of other people to do that. And indeed, things are less bad. Speedway is less ugly, I would say. And we have standards for some urban design. Now, urban design expresses the culture that creates it. And sometimes you wonder how much urban design is really going on in Tucson, or whether we're letting the city design itself. So here's a view of what I would suggest is sort of spontaneous urban development that really wasn't designed or planned, but this expresses our society. It expresses our system. It expresses consumer capitalism. This is the built expression. This is the archaeological evidence that we have a consumer capitalist society based on private automobile transit primarily. And this is what it looks like. When you take that system and you turn it loose in a broad alluvial desert plain, this is what it looks like. This is who we are as a society. Not all of us, but the majority and this ruling system. It gives you neighborhoods like this, which are so banal, where your presence on the street is expressed by your garage. So you drive into your garage and go into your house and never see your neighbor. This is my friend Joe Wilder has called these types of suburban houses snout houses, because they just have this big snout out to the road and no presence on the street. And this clearly, you know, this is inherently unsustainable. You know, you cannot keep doing this, which to me is the definition of sustainability. If it's something that you can continue to do, it's sustainable. Otherwise, forget about it. Now, it was not always thus. These are some of the streets in early Tucson, Hispanic Tucson, Mexican Tucson. None of these buildings exist. None of these. This, you're actually looking down, I believe this would be Jackson Street, looking towards the Santa Rita Hotel, which we just destroyed a couple years ago to put up the so-called Tucson Electric Power Building. But this was indigenous architecture of our region, built by people from here, and built really, you know, before you could plug in an air conditioner. People built with adobe. That's what we had. Again, this is, I believe, Pennington Street looking towards the river, gone. Here's the central business district of Tucson as it was. And we not only tore down all the Mexican and Spanish adobe architecture, we tore down the gringo brick architecture in our city center. None of these buildings that you're looking at stands today. None of them, not one. There's the Santa Rita Hotel. We just obliterated our city core. Now, we did leave the barrio south of Cushing Street, although the city planners of the 1960s wanted to take it all. I've seen models where there was a cloverleaf freeway on top of what's left of the barrio to transition from 10 to 19 to the Butterfield Expressway. They wanted to take it all the way to 22nd Street, but they didn't get the federal grants from the Johnson administration, so they only tore down half the barrio. But we lost a lot of historic adobe housing stock. This is one of the maps of the Sanborn company, Sanborn Insurance. Now these buildings actually, these survive. This is our surviving barrio, everything south of Cushing. Although they took this through and took out these buildings and Main Avenue was cut off. So there is this basic housing stock that comes from our Spanish and Mexican period. Now, we all know there's a place called La Placita. Well, there once was a little plaza on the mesa. We had a little rise in the landform. We had a cathedral, the Cathedral of St. Augustine, built in 1862 to 1869. Again, it's all gone. There is one building here that exists, the Charlie Brown House over here, that I now is home to Ben's Bells. But all the rest is gone. It used to be the old Adobe Patio, which was a fabulous Mexican restaurant where people could go and experience a courtyard. They could walk through the saguan and have fabulous local food in an historic courtyard. Unfortunately, that closed down some years ago, like so many things. But anyway, this is a little editorial comment. Maybe everything I say is editorial. What I think we need is fewer cultural centers and more culture. because when you close down a building and make it a cultural center, you take it out of circulation. Architecture is culture, and you can experience culture by experiencing architecture. This is from the Journal of the Southwest, edited by Joe Wilder. These are figure ground analyses of the architectural, texture of Tucson, going from 1886 on the left up through 1919 with significant Anglo-American kind of brick commercial architecture, and then tearing down 80 acres of the historic center of Tucson for the so-called convention center. We lost this. We lost this Sonoran Mexican urbanism where the houses are to the street and the private spaces in the middle. We lost our plaza. We lost our cathedral. We lost our gringo courthouse. We lost everything. How many cities, tear down the entire core of their historic center? It's ironic. In Europe, twice during the 20th century, they attempted collective suicide and bombed their city centers. In the United States, we destroyed more historic architecture during urban renewal than was destroyed in World War II. Again, looking south, there's our cathedral, there's the Placita de la Mesilla. Here's this adobe urbanism with internal patios, houses to the street, classic Tucson architecture. It wasn't valued. Even the cathedral wasn't valued. It was replaced. And this public square, the urban center, this is what we got after, we hired expert planners from the national level. Garrett Eckbo, the greatest landscape architect of the 20th century, came and helped us plan our community center. So they tore down the center of the community to build the community center. And they gave us this utterly banal, deadly, I don't even want to call it architecture. I don't know what it is. Bureaucracy made manifest, concretized bureaucracy, and kind of a provincial ripoff of the Lincoln Center. And this is one of Garrett Eckbo's greatest ideas. He had never been to Tucson or the Southwest. When he visited in the 60s, he took a trip to Sabino Canyon. He liked the rocks. He liked the waterfalls. I'll bring Sabino Canyon downtown. I'm sorry, this is not an idea. This is not, but then the fountains were a failure from the very beginning, and we don't have to go into that, but bad ideas have bad results. Now, so that's kind of the foreground of where we are, and the bulk of my presentation comes from a book I wrote for HUD about 15 years ago, and think, well, the book's getting kind of old and out of date, but the ideas in the book are hundreds of years old, so in a way, I don't think it'll ever be out of date. You can find this book, Southwest Housing Traditions, by going to the HUD user website.org and just search the title, and you can download it as a PDF. And it's full of examples of places I've visited and documented on behalf of the government, showing an alternative way to building besides the typical suburban sprawl that's destroying everything. Arispe, Sonora, on the Rio Sonora Valley, is a beautiful little agricultural town if you're fortunate enough to have family and land there. It's basically a paradise on earth. There's several towns on the Rio Sonora. There's Aconchi, there's Baviacora, there's Banamichi. Arispe was the Spanish colonial capital of what is now Sonora, Chihuahua, New Mexico, and Arizona. This was the capital city. You see it has a cathedral, it has a square. Juan Bautista de Anza, the founder of San Francisco, California, is buried beneath the floor of this church. So this is an historic city. And the architecture is, again, it's this urban Spanish. They got it, of course, from the Arabs. You find this in North Africa. You find it in southern Spain. Your house is your defense against the elements. You live inside in your courtyard. Now, those are the design ideas, but the other element, of course, is what you build out of. It's important what you build. It's important what you build out of. In this book for HUD, my assistant Christina Newman and I researched the performance of thermal mass houses versus low thermal mass or frame houses with insulation. And of course, the principle of thermal mass is that it evens out the highs and lows of the extremes of heat and cold, and acts as a thermal flywheel. And houses that are based on thermal mass perform better than houses based on insulation. Another element that David has done a great deal of research on is the embodied energy in building materials. How much energy do you have to expend to create these materials? And not surprisingly, steel is at the top of the list. I think actually aluminum is even higher in terms of kilowatt hours required to create a cubic meter. This is actually metric. This is from a European source that I was reading. Timber is surprisingly high in terms of kilowatt hours. Well, you have to cut the trees down and haul them to where they're going. Concrete, of course, requires calcining, limestone, and shale. Brick is high energy. Earth, look at earth down here. 5 to 10 kilowatt hours per cubic meter. So speaking of earth, we look at examples in the research, traditional earth buildings built in the desert, and all the principles here still make sense. Thick walls, small openings to keep out heat and glare, compact shapes. That's one of the things that often gets lost. If you build a sort of a sheltering shape, you reduce your exposure to the elements, you reduce your heat loss and gain. And this building has super high thermal mass. It works really well even to this day. I mean, it's a ruin, but because of those thick walls, it actually moderates the temperature around it. And of course, now it has a big shade structure over it. This is what it looked like at the end of the 1800s. The building was intact up until Anglo farmers around Casa Grande began borrowing roof beams from the old Hohokam ruin to build their ranch houses, and that hastened the deterioration of the monument. Another example, that was a Native American example. We look at the Hispanic example of the Saguan house, which the central breezeway is used to bring air from the garden through the house and ventilate the rooms. Again, it's a compact form, pedestrian scale. These are all principles of urban, arid region urbanism that we encourage, and the high thermal mass walls. And it's also a beautiful design. It's classical, it's balanced, it's well proportioned. And the Saguan functions as your passive ventilation, your evaporative cooler, as it were. The garden in back is filled with flowers and water. The saguan pulls the air through the house. This is an example in Ures, Sonora, which again, this house has neither heating nor cooling, but it works because of the way it's designed and built. So that's the research I did for HUD. This was a talk I gave at the U about infill, which I think is important for the future, filling in rather than sprawling out. Of course, it depends what type of infill you do. In this particular graphic, I had identified all the potential building sites. Red highlighted land is vacant, and then the blacktop is parking lots, which is something I advocate and others, that all parking lots are potential building sites. We should build over them. We should use our land better. We should reduce the heat island effect. Here's a couple of projects of mine that are based on the principles outlined: infill housing, the use of courtyards. This is a residence on South Main Avenue in the barrio. A courtyard in the center of the house, which is actually the largest room in the house. The others are gathered around it. This is a somewhat conventional solution in that it's a family with 2 cars. We park in the back. There's a little guest house, caretaker house here, but we created our own kind of Sonoran streetscape here. And we were building out of cement stabilized adobe, John Acton's block. I proposed 2 smaller houses to the east that unfortunately were not built. I was hoping my client would build these as affordable houses. They're L-shaped courtyard buildings. Let's see how they work. So, oops, they're over here. You'd have your kind of public spaces, living and dining here, a kitchen and bath, all the plumbing in one wall, 2 bedrooms, and all the rooms look into the courtyard. Now, the city requires you to park a car off the street. So you say, oh, that's my parking space, right? But then you use that as your courtyard and you park here. So ways around the rules, and that's what it was intended to look like. And that's what the front part looks like, which is rather fortress-like, but I think in our climate, that's actually probably an appropriate response to the west elevation. You want a thick wall, you want small openings, and of course the garden, the central garden, is the focal point of the house, and it's what makes the house livable. Just south of downtown on Main. Another way to approach the whole livability and energy efficiency is to recycle old buildings. They have a lot of embodied energy. They have brick, they have steel, they have glass. So this is a project actually right behind my office on Herbert Alley, an old warehouse. It used to be a furniture warehouse, and a couple got it and wanted to live there, but you couldn't live in a building that didn't have an exit from the sleeping area. So the secret was to create a courtyard by taking off part of the roof and opening it to the sky. There's the before picture. It was basically just a warehouse on the alley. And then this is actually an after picture where we replaced that beat up corrugated with 1/8-inch steel plate, let it rust. There's the loading dock before the renovation. We took off 2 bays of rooftop to make a courtyard here. And then they had a safe exit from the sleeping area per the building code. Lots of light for the north-facing light for the art studio. This is my client, Paul Moloff. Very into color. These people are way into color. And Shelley's an artist, a painter. and obviously very, very creative. So these are the principles I lay on my students: compact forms, reduce exposure, correct solar orientation, self-shading building forms. If you're going to build buildings, place them so that they can create shaded outdoor space. Higher density, better land use, preserve more habitat. And when you do that, when you design for density, you need to provide private outdoor space, which means you need courtyards or roof terraces. Oh, this is a little thought I've formed for my students. The most important factor in the sustainability of a city is its urban form. How is it built? And a compact city will be more sustainable than a spread out city. Some examples, some other examples of around town. This is actually one from the 1940s. It's on 4th Street, just west of Alvernon. I just discovered it out riding my bike. And it's actually, I think there's 20 dwelling units altogether gathered around a courtyard. It's very humble, unassuming. It's white painted concrete block, 2 stories and single story townhome units. But it creates an environment. It creates a whole environment. It's called La Plazuela de las Encantadas. And it's actually kind of an exclusive, the units sell quickly. If someone moves out, usually a friend of theirs moves in, because it creates an environment that is, livable in this hot, arid climate of ours. Now, I will say, all of the things that the Plazuela does would not be allowed by Tucson zoning code. They want a 24-foot wide fire truck access. They want all your parking on site. They want trash and recycling pickup. And actually, if you meet the city of Tucson's commercial site plan standards for a project like this, you basically have to pave the whole site, turn a fire truck around on it. Another example of very humane, sustainable architecture, the Arizona Inn, built in 1930, again, built in the Great Depression. It's not ostentatious. The architecture is simple. Of course, it has terrific grounds, but the forms, the courtyards, the use of this brick screen to get privacy but permit ventilation, some drought-tolerant plants, these kinds of spaces where the buildings bridge over and you go from one courtyard to another. These are very creative architectural ideas, and there's no reason we couldn't build like this and make affordable housing using the Arizona Inn as a model, I believe. Now, a couple other projects. How are we doing for time here, Stuart? I got about, 5 minutes, do I? Maybe.
Bob, you've got 7 minutes.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I'm on a roll. So here's another example of a more recent and contemporary infill. This is 6 live-work artist studios designed by my friend Arthur Perkins, terrific architect we lost Arthur Perkins to Paris, the one in France, not in Texas. But he put 6 dwellings on, I believe this is 2 lots, and was able to do so by gathering. He puts parking on this corner, he puts parking on this corner, and then the houses create a space. He used recycled steel windows, cement block, very, again, austere, simple materials, but creating a sheltered courtyard. And there's why Arthur moved to Paris. Berthier is a painter from Paris, and they have a son named Jacques Perkins, which is great. This is the kind of architecture Arthur created, the double height loft space, and another one just down the block on Highland Avenue, another 6 dwelling unit development with a separate studio across a little walkway, and very successful infill housing, creative. This is how it looked when it was built 25 years ago. Clever use of materials, durable materials, simple materials, humble materials, good light. And now this is how it is now. It's grown up, the landscaping is mature, and it creates a wonderful environment for 6 families to live in. And this type of housing can be categorized, I think, as high density, low rise, which is a philosophy of design. Now, I'm actually going to quickly race ahead here because I'm running out of time. I did want to make I have another example of high density, low rise. Here we go. Carolyn mentioned that Jody Gibbs had passed away, the architect, who was the first architect I ever worked for at the Tucson Design Center. And Jody's magnum opus, literarily, not architecturally, was The People's Urban History, this comic book history of Tucson. This tells you something about Jody. No part of this publication may be reproduced in any form for profit, but he gave me permission to scan it. It's the history of Tucson from the beginning. I'll just give you a little taste of it because if I can, I'll make it available as a link So here's the desert evolving. It changed from a tropical rainforest to the Sonoran Desert. All the plants and animals adapted except for one. You know? Anyway, it's very humorous, and it's also accurate. And I don't know if you can see this over here, but here's a Native American explaining how they cultivated multiple crops so they didn't deplete the land. And then here's a scientist over here saying exactly, it's true. And if you look at his little name tag, I don't know if you can see that, Dr. Sellout, PhD. This is Jody Schumer. Jody was incredibly brilliant and funny, and his analysis. And this is true. Here's the native people playing ball, making art, making their own clothing, making their own pottery, and still having time for a rich cultural life. And this is Jody's commentary on today. Leisure time today is often no more than violent miseducation and manipulation in movies. He wrote this 40 years ago. It's still true. And with that, I will conclude my remarks.
Well, thank you, Bob. Do we have any questions in our chat box yet? So we've got a couple of minutes. Well, one thing is there a way to, would you let people see your slides afterwards?
Sure, absolutely. I'll save it as a PDF and I'll send it to you.
Okay, beautiful. So let's see, how will we do that in terms of getting it to people? Just know that Stuart at sustainabletucson.org will be glad to send you a slide on request. Now, what's the name of your book again?
It's called Southwest Housing Traditions, Design Materials Performance. And it's available through the Housing Urban Development Department.
That's great. Could you repeat those principles of traditional desert design? There's compact form, there's solar orientation. We've got enough time. If you want to,
shall I pull that up again? Yeah.
Maybe articulate those just a little bit more.
Yeah. I guess I do tend to race, don't I?
Well, we're running to keep up, and I think just a quick review would be great.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's always a good idea to come back to it. Okay, I'm going to reopen it here. See, I ought to have them all memorized, right? Okay, here we go. I would summarize them as follows. Okay. Yes, the first one would be compact forms, correct solar orientation, principal.
What is correct? What is correct solar orientation?
So you'd have the long axis of your building running north-south, so you receive favorable winter sunlight, and minimize your east and west exposures, because that's the most difficult sunlight to control, because the sun's just burning in as it rises or sets, right? You can't control it with an overhang. On the south, you can control it with an overhang or a thick adobe wall, and that's how the Sonoran row houses worked. They had 2-foot thick walls, which is just right to shade your window if you set your window back. So,
and what is it about the high windows or the high ceilings that helps out?
So that allows the air to stratify by temperature. So the warmer air rises up and the cooler air falls down where the people are. And that was basically your passive conditioning. That's how people survived or still do survive in hot, arid regions where there's not abundant, cheap, artificial energy. Your house has to be your protection against the elements. So your house is your air conditioner if it's built in that regard. So the tall ceilings allow that stratification. And again, it's people's expectations of comfort have evolved, in a way. This architecture that I'm featuring is pre-industrial, before coal-fired power plants would give you cheap electricity. Your building, your environment was your mechanical system. So self-shading building forms. And then sharing walls. Sharing walls is important because if you share a wall between houses, number one, you minimize exposure to heat and cold. You save costs because you build the wall once, you use it twice, right? And again, you're more compact. So it helps you all around. So anyway, those are the basic principles that if we followed them, we'd have a more sustainable city. And we're starting to follow them.
That's great. Mike Herman asks, are the breezeways that are there for passive ventilation, are they more effective if they face a particular direction?
Yes, what you want to do with the saguan, the breezeway, is you want to have a lush courtyard on one side and then a paved street on the other, because then you get convective heat rising off the street and it pulls the cool air from the courtyard through the house. And this was something that was developed by the Arabs in southern Spain, 500 years ago. The Alhambra is built this way. It has a sunny courtyard and a shady courtyard and the buildings in between.
Hmm.
It's engineering.
Is there anything in city code that's in the way of our following these practices now?
Less and less. There was at one time, but I think actually over the last 20 years, in fact, David Eisenberg, our next speaker, has done a lot to convince the code officials to allow alternative materials and alternative practices. So there has been a lot of progress made over the last 2 decades, and you're allowed to, build a higher percentage of your lot, which would allow you to put, say, 2 houses on one lot instead of just one, and that also helps affordability. And the thing is, when you do that, you do need to take design steps to maintain your neighbor's privacy.
And it looked like
Way to David, I think. I'll toss it over your way.
okay. Let's have David carry. Let me introduce him briefly. David co-founded and has led the Tucson-based nonprofit Development Center for Appropriate Technology since 1992. We first probably heard that term appropriate technology when Jerry Brown had an office of appropriate technology when he was governor his first time around. And people thought that was pretty far out. And David is carrying that tradition forward. This development center launched their program Building Sustainability into the Codes in 1995. So they started creating a sustainable context for building codes, and he'll be talking about that today. He has all kinds of building experience. Started out as an architecture student, but when he saw what was being taught and what was being done in architecture at the time, a lot of urban renewal and what's called the New Brutalism, he went into fine arts instead and has kept that fine touch ever since. He's done troubleshooting construction at Biosphere 2. He's worked with steel, concrete, masonry, wood, adobe, rammed earth. He co-authored the Straw Bale House book and has worked extensively on developing building codes for sustainable techniques and sustainable materials such as straw bale, cob, and tiny houses. He served 2 terms on the board of directors for the U.S. Green Building Council, where he founded and chaired their code committee for 9 years. So David has had his hands on really important policy issues for a long time. He's on the board of Sustainable Tucson and the Tucson 2030 District. And David, we're so glad you're taking tonight to share your insights with us.
So, well, thank you, Bob, first of all. It's great context setting for where we are and how we got where we are and how we got what we have here, actually. And so it's great to reconnect with Bob. We've known each other for a long time, but this has been fun getting to do something together. This is one of my favorite quotes because I think it basically sums up what's most important. Our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors. I don't think we're doing a particularly good job at that at the moment. But it's a good reminder. So I'm going to focus on a few things in this talk. One thing is to really look at the fact that, yes, we're in a climate emergency and we're going to be for the foreseeable future. And in particular, I think we have to do some real rethinking about buildings, energy efficiency, materials, choices, and also looking at, what needs to change and how we might go about creating some of those changes. And I'm going to share a bunch of resources, and I too will make my presentation available as a PDF file. And there's a zillion links in it, so you don't have to write them down, and you'll be able to get them either from Stuart or directly from me if you'd like. Oh, this is happening again. Let's see. So, yeah, my organization is called the Development Center for Appropriate Technology, so people are always saying what's appropriate technology, and the classic definition is it's the simplest or lowest level of technology you can use to do what you need to do well. Not a specific level of technology, but the right level, not more than you need or less than you need. And appropriateness has to do with context, really, you know, what you're trying to do, where you are, what you have available, what the culture is, etc. But my favorite definition is that it's technology that ordinary people can use for their own benefit and the benefit of their community, that doesn't make them dependent on systems over which they have no control. Which is basically, if you unpack that, it's about technology that enhances the local capacity to meet local needs. And we have a website, which is way out of date, dcat.net. And there's also a public Facebook group called DCAT group that you can find. This is on. So here's an alarming bit of information. According to this report from a couple of years ago, Tucson is the third fastest warming city in the US. And that has implications for our buildings, also has implications for our water and just about everything else. So we need to take that seriously. Once again, I'm not able to advance slides without scrolling, which is tricky. Okay, so what are we going to do about that? Well, one of the things is that we need to think really carefully about what we're doing so that our solutions don't just add to the problems. And that's true for our existing buildings and new ones. This graphic is looking at something that's really important, which is that there are two kinds of building related impacts to the climate. One, the operating emissions that we're always focused on, energy efficiency, et cetera. And the other is the embodied emissions, what it took, actually what the impacts are from creating the building itself. So one thing I like to talk about is frames of reference, and basically how we look at things and what we think about, because basically the lenses that we look through and the ways that we think about problems determine what it is that we see. So focus is exclusionary. When you focus on something, what you're actually doing is blocking everything else out. It's really good to know that. But if you're going to see things really in context and in relationship to other things, you need to learn to shift your focus between the details and the big picture back and forth, so you can not only see the things, but you can see their relationships. This is one thing about architecture. It's one of the few professions that actually kind of teaches and requires people to learn to continually do that, to shift your focus from details to big pictures and back. But here's an example from my work. This is a purpose statement, the intent statement for the International Building Code. The big picture is the purpose of this code is to safeguard public health, safety, and general welfare from hazards attributed to the built environment. And the rest is detail. In the intent statement, it's fairly high-level detail, but in the code, it's real detail. It's intricate detail, and it's incredibly difficult in the code's realm to ever actually get back out to the big picture. And so a lot of big picture issues never get seen. So codes are really good at dealing with the hazards that they're designed to address. And so that enables us to build buildings that don't typically harm their occupants in obvious ways anyway. And because of that, we basically have, most people think that we've addressed the risks associated with buildings or the hazards. What we've actually done is move them in space and time. We've moved them away from the building site and distributed them out into all the natural systems that we depend on for our survival. And we move them from the present to the future to all species, including our own. And it appears, though, that we're safeguarding the public. So one of the things I've pointed out is that looking at buildings through building codes is like looking at them through a microscope. You can see really important things like these categories of hazard that the codes address, but you can't see these other things. So if you take your eye away from that lens, there's a whole galaxy of other hazards attributable to the built environment that are not regulated by building codes. In fact, many of them aren't regulated at all. And yet they're being created and they're being ignored in the codes realm. And if you try and address many of these things in the building code, you're basically told that it's not in their purview, that that's EPA's problem or OSHA or NIOSH or some other entity, not the code organizations. But the reality is it's not an either or. We actually need to be able to see the full risk profile of what it is that we're doing and figure out how to balance these hazards so that we're not creating bigger hazards out of sight while we're protecting people in individual buildings. So another kind of similar place that I want to talk a little about is when we're looking at buildings in terms of their energy use and their climate impact. So we talk about, these days we talk about carbon and carbon equivalents, CO2 equivalents, not just energy. But if you look at this life cycle of a building, starting up in the upper right-hand corner with raw material extraction and processing, transportation, manufacturing, transportation to the construction site, the building process, and then the operation of the building, the use phase, then, you know, repair, refurbishment, reuse, eventually demolition at the end of the life of the building, or in some recycling or disposal of the materials. We look at all of that, and yet when we think about what's going on, we see that we focused all of our attention on almost exclusively on energy efficiency and operating energy, or on renewable energy systems that we can put on these buildings. And we're not paying any attention to the embodied energy or embodied carbon emissions, the climate impact of creating the building. And this is a big problem. It's a growing problem, in part because what we're doing as we go forward. So now there's this big focus on super energy efficient, high performing buildings or net zero energy buildings. And what we're doing to the embodied carbon or embodied energy or embodied climate impact of those buildings to get to net zero is we're dramatically increasing the impact to eliminate operating energy. What that means is, if we look, what we have is that essentially with existing conventional buildings, the operational energy is much larger than the embodied energy. Typically over the years, people said it was in the range of 10, 12, 15, in extreme cases, 20% of the total lifetime energy use of the building. As we increased the energy performance, it became a higher percentage. When you get to net zero energy buildings, it represents virtually all or close to all of the energy that's used. One of the issues that raises is when those impacts are happening. So even with a high performance building, not a net zero energy building, the yellow bar at the bottom, it represents, this is for, from the Architecture 2030, this is for a building, a high performance building built in 2015. You can see the blue bar is the increasing impact or cumulative use of energy, you know, going forward over time. By 2030, you can see that the embodied emissions or the embodied impact is much greater than the operating impact. And even by 2050, it's still greater. But another way of thinking about this is that blue bar that's growing at the top, the triangle, if you think of a net zero energy building, that's not happening. So in essence, what we've done is brought all or almost all of the climate impact of the building to the present. And in order to be able to do that, we've increased that impact by using foam insulation, really high-tech window systems, putting renewable energy systems on these buildings, all of which basically is increasing their immediate impact and not having it extend out over time. The time implications are really important. Getting to net zero is not necessarily the best thing we can do from a climate standpoint. We need to think about how we're getting there, what we're using in order to achieve that. So one other thing about this is there are two kinds of embodied carbon. So most people are talking about the carbon, the CO2, carbon dioxide emissions are equivalent when they're talking about embodied carbon. But there's also physically embodied carbon, that is molecules of carbon that are in the materials that we could be building with. And so if you look at straw, for instance, or there are a whole bunch of bio-based materials, hemp, wood, straw, cellulose insulation. If we're using regenerative agriculture and sustainable forestry practices, we can actually be greatly reducing the impact of the materials in their production. We can also be sequestering carbon in the soil as well as in our buildings. And this can make a huge difference. We can really begin to get to actual net zero carbon buildings. Now, I want to talk briefly about insulation. Bob was talking about the embodied energy in steel and concrete and those things. So take a look at spray foam or regular polystyrene or mineral wool, fiberglass bat. And then those are all high impact insulation materials. They have a big climate impact in their production. And look at wool, dense packed cellulose, cork, hempcrete, straw bale. These are actually insulation materials that sequester far more carbon in the building than they emit in their production. So this is a way that we can begin to get high performance buildings that that are carbon sinks rather than sources. Sorry. The 2030 Architecture 2030 has a smart materials palette website that has a lot of information, and you know there's some guidance there. First thing they say is repurpose existing buildings, use existing buildings, salvage materials, materials that naturally sequester carbon, etc. Great guidance there. And there has been a lot of work recently in looking at the carbon impacts of building materials and really looking for alternatives that don't add to the problem, that begin to solve some of these issues. I won't talk much about that, but there's lots out there. There's some great books. this first one, Making Better Buildings by Chris Magwood, goes through both alternative and conventional building materials and systems, and gives really specific life cycle information about those materials, their pros and cons, there's sourcing, use. It's a fabulous resource. Chris also wrote the Sustainable Home Design book. All of these are good sources, and there's links at the end to these and other books. So let's talk for a minute here about, sorry, scrolling. You know, if we're thinking about upgrading our existing buildings, and this is a big issue here, we have a huge number of substandard, aging, you know, deteriorating houses. And so we have to figure out how we're going to deal with that. And with the heating climate, you know, worsening, we're going to need to figure some of these things out. If you're thinking about remodeling an existing building or upgrading it, it's a good idea to start with an energy audit. So somebody who really knows how to look at a building and tell you, you know, where the opportunities are, where the problems are. Look at landscaping to create microclimates. One thing Bob was talking about, west and east exposures, and one thing you can do in many cases to mitigate some of that is what you plant on the east and west sides, you know, of your building. You know, obviously there are opportunities for gray water and rainwater harvesting, passive solar strategies that Bob was talking about. You know, let the sun and heat in the winter and keep it out in the summer. And then another thing, you know, Bob actually talked a little about is, you know, making choices that actually serve more than one purpose. So here's an example. Mats Merman and Judy Knox had this next door to the house they lived in, this really ugly, hard to heat and cool concrete block house that they added a wraparound porch to it, and they wrapped it in straw bales. And so they ended up with all that thermal mass inside the installation, isolated from the fluctuating temperatures outside. And that thermal mass works even better with a little insulation on the outside. Plus, it's beautiful. But the other thing is, under the bales or behind the bales, they were also able to upgrade electrical and plumbing systems, you know, and then keep them, you know, basically not have to disrupt the inside of the building to do those upgrades. And you can do, sometimes you can do the same thing on a roof. You can add insulation and do some plumbing and electrical upgrades on the roof deck. Anyway, there's way too much detailed stuff to talk about, but there are some good resources. And, you know, like I said before, the greenest thing you can do is probably upgrade or reuse an existing building. It's also really important, though, to recognize that existing buildings have potential hazards like lead or asbestos or mold, etc. So it's a good idea to pay attention to those things and understand appropriate ways to deal with them. There's some good resources here. I won't talk too much about them. You'll be able to check them out when you get a copy of this. The big challenge we have is how are we going to deal with this at a community level with all of these houses that need so much work? And I think there's a community level conversation that needs to be had, and hopefully we can initiate some of that, because I think there are things that are going to need to change to make it easier. The codes have gotten better. Some of the policies have gotten better, but there's still a lot of challenges. The there are some really interesting ideas though. And one is to think more about cooperative sort of community-based things we can do. I'm a big fan of co-ops and worker-owned co-ops, which are for-profit businesses, but they're owned by, the people who work there. But there are also potential things like purchasing co-ops, like a neighborhood association, could look at essentially creating a cooperative way to buy materials that are going to be needed in upgrading, a lot of the same kinds of houses in a given neighborhood. Also, we know financing is going to be a big issue. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, could we create a bond initiative that was specifically to create a big, low interest revolving loan fund, a pool of money that would basically be available, and the interest would build that pool of money. It would grow, and we could find ways to afford to do the work we need to do. And another thing is, maybe we could tie all this to slowing down the bleeding of energy dollars out of the community. And what am I talking about? Well, in most places, somewhere between 70 and 80 cents of every dollar spent on energy leaves the local economy. Now think about that. Whether it's natural gas or coal or gasoline or whatever it is that we're using around the U.S., most of the money that's spent on energy does not stay in the local economy. So think about slowing that flow down. Think about what it costs to do that. They say follow the money. Well, that money goes right out of town. But imagine if we could create an energy dollar dashboard, a community energy dollar dashboard, so that we could see in something like real time all the energy sources we're using, how much we're using, what we're paying for it, how much of that money is staying local or leaving town. What if we could see that? What if we all could see that? What we would see is that energy efficiency and renewable energy are not costs, they're investments. And they're the most powerful local economic development engine I can think of. The dollars that we stop exporting could be creating jobs and wealth that stays more and more local. And maybe rehabilitating our housing could be a big chunk of that kind of work. So what things need to change? Well, I think we probably still need more flexibility in our building and zoning codes, including we have an existing building code, which is an attempt to differentiate between the building code that's for new buildings and what's different about dealing with existing buildings, which is more challenging and often more expensive. And so we have an existing building code, but I think it could be better. And the question is, how can we begin to really look at these opportunities, the barriers that we're facing, see them as opportunities. And there are some inspiring sources of information for some of this stuff. City Repair in Portland, Oregon, their website is fantastic. They've done a lot of really interesting stuff, mostly in terms of zoning and creating more community solutions. There are a lot of really interesting things in Portland. They have a community code committee that basically works on developing alternative code solutions, works with the building department. There's also this great thing, it was called the Sustainable Community Development Code Framework, that was developed at the Rocky Mountain Land Use Institute in Colorado. It's now at the University of Vermont Law School, and it's being maintained and updated. And it has sustainable policies, codes, practices for land use and development codes and zoning codes from all around the country. It's a fantastic resource. These are a few articles that are really recent about focusing on a bunch of these issues that I've just been talking about, and a good starting point for more conversation. And the green links here are all some of the best sources of information about embodied carbon and about really dealing with in proactive ways with the climate crisis. And then there's some other really good, some of my other favorite sources of information. Originate is a local materials store here that is a good place to check in with. The city and county have some good information. Some of it's kind of dated, but and whoops, these are some of the books I was talking about. Links to information about them, and I'll end there.
David, let's start right away with a question from Dante. He points out there's embodied energy that would influence the choice of materials. There's also the ease of recycling. He was specifically wondering about metal roofing, high embodied energy, but can be completely recycled. Does that potential for complete recycling give it extra credit?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting things about steel is that well, for one thing, most steel that is in use that we get in various products already has a reasonable and significant recycled content. And it's one thing about steel that, unlike many other materials, is it's recycling without downcycling. Most materials, when you recycle them, the quality is reduced. And so a lot of materials can't be used for the same purposes that they were originally used for. One of the great things about Adobe is that, well, stabilized Adobe is a little different, but unstabilized Adobe, you can just wet it and mix it up and reuse it. It's a recyclable material going way back and way forward. But metal roofing, I think, is really a good choice in many cases. And one of the things about it, talking about multiple purposes or goals, with your choices, is that it's great for rainwater harvesting, and it's really durable.
That's great. We're trying to sort of take turns with David and Bob, but here's one for both of you. Maybe Bob, you can start. What do you think about the tension between neighbor concerns versus higher density building, which may mean two-story homes rather than one-story, and smaller setbacks? These seem very small next to high rises, but in certain neighborhoods, even going 2 stories feels disturbing to the people who are there already. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's certainly the case. Although if you think about it, if all of Tucson had been built on a 2-story module, it would be 1/4 the size that it is today, right? It would be much more compact. Certainly in other traditions, there is a larger practice of building multiple stories, walk-ups, 2 and 3 stories. And out here, in the Wild West, people want to be the last pioneer at the edge of town with a view of the mountains, and they get upset about that. So I think there's certain neighborhoods and certain parts of town where there would be a lot of resistance to building multiple stories. But in the older neighborhoods, the historic neighborhoods, for example, Sam Hughes or Armory Park has a lot of 2-story buildings. It has to be, of course, very thoughtfully designed and carefully built so as to respect your neighbor's concerns. I think many of the potential conflicts or tensions could be solved by design and also by considerate neighbors. I've had some clients who initially wanted some big expansion with a second story and a roof deck. And after we got it designed and they looked at it and we looked on site, they says, you know, I just don't want to do that to my neighbors. So I mean, partly is there's the whole human element of wanting to be a good neighbor and preserve your neighbor's view while maybe enhancing your own. But a design can address a lot of that, but not all of it.
You know, years ago there was I've been trying to remember who it was, a state legislator who, you know, was embroiled in all of this sprawl and density. He basically said there are only two things that I'm against: sprawl and density. And you know, the reality is, you know, we have to figure out how to accommodate each other, and you know, it makes me think about neighborhood associations versus homeowners associations. They're not the same thing. One is concerned with neighborhoods and neighbors, and one is concerned with property values. You know, they both can help resolve things, but homeowners associations tend to create more conflicts, I think, than they resolve. But you know, all of these things are issues that need to be dealt with. One of the really interesting, you know, mixed things that's happening, you know, is this whole evolution of tiny houses and the potential for adding more density through ADUs, accessory dwelling units. You know, and they can be beneficial in terms of financially helping people, you know, pay their mortgage, etc. But, you know, one of the things that was pointed out in Portland, one of the things that happened, the goal was to deal with, you know, to basically have increased density with you know, less of the problems. But it turned out that a lot of people were turning them into Airbnb. They were just, you know, vacation rentals, not densifying, you know, the city, you know, but just bringing, you know, people in from out of town temporarily. And so you have to, you know, it's one more of those places where you need to be careful about, you know, what it is you're trying to do and how that works. But they offer, you know, there's now in the residential, the International Residential Code, the national, you know, essentially the National Residential Building Code, there's an appendix for tiny houses that I helped write and get adopted. There are other appendices in the 2021 code. There'll be 4 appendices that we were involved with. Appendix Q is tiny houses, R is light straw clay construction, S is straw bale construction, and U is cob construction. Those things are all now in the building code, which it only took 20 years to get straw bale in the building code.
Well, David, speaking of straw bale, Carol comments that it certainly sounds like an optimal building material here in Tucson. Do we have any public examples of straw bale in town?
Well, there are some. It's hard to find the you know, ones that are where people are open to, you know, to the public. I'm just trying to think about. I mean, I know there are a bunch of them around town, but it's been kind of funny. So the straw bale revival really got its big start here in Tucson with Mott's Merriman and Judy Knox and their little business out on Bale Unlimited, he called it. And for a while, there was a lot of Bale building going on around here. But now most of it's happening in California. It's happening in Colorado, New Mexico, Oregon, Washington, and not so much here. Although Bill and Athena Steen, the Canelo project down southeast of here, they continue to teach classes, they teach workshops. They do amazing stuff with earthen and natural plasters and all kinds of things. That's a place that's worth checking out. I think
Yeah.
it's
How can we find them?
caneloproject.com.
What kind of project, David?
Canelo, Canelo, which is a little town, sort of ghost town down beyond Patagonia.
So the
And
CaneloProject.com, you say?
I think that's the website. And Bill, the Steens, Steen, Bill and Athena. Athena is, I call her Athena, the goddess of plaster.
Hmm.
She is absolutely brilliant. She's from the Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico, a family of potters. Her mother was an architect, brilliant woman, Lena Swensel. But anyway, straw bales, it's a really good material great for this climate and lots of climates. And among those resources, the books that I showed are a couple of really good resources if you're wanting to do straw bale buildings.
David, speaking of the resources, there was a request for your slideshow as well as for Bob's. Is there a way you'd be willing to make that accessible?
Yeah. So my email address directly is strawnet, STRAWNET @gmail. Type it in here. Are you doing that?
I'm putting it in, yes.
Okay, great. So if you send me an email, I will email you a PDF of. I'm going to go through the way I share my PowerPoint presentations is as notes as a PDF file. So what you get is on each page the slide and then the commentary that goes with it. And so it'll be a day or two before I have time to go through and touch up my notes because I made some changes today to this presentation. But I'll be happy to share it.
Okay. Watching the time and watching the questions, we got half a dozen already come in since I last looked. Dwayne would just like to comment regarding steel roof. He says it will outlast even a 35-year rooftop solar installation. So that actually saves on reinstallation of the solar in terms of roof replacement.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I do really like metal roofs. They're a little noisy in the hail or heavy rain, but we don't get hail too often here. But they're great for rainwater harvesting. Another thing, that I didn't mention, that there are elastomeric reflective roof coatings that you can use to both reduce the heat load, from a roof, but also extend the life of roofs. And I think most of them, when they're cured, they're actually better for rainwater harvesting in terms of the quality of the water coming off the roof than coming off of, say, asphalt and fiberglass shingles. Not probably as good as a metal roof, but pretty good, I think.
Well, that's great to know. So Stephen asked, is there an example? And Bob, I'm not sure, one of you may know this. Do we have in Tucson an example of a cooperative neighborhood sustainable innovation?
Mhm. Well, I know historic preservation in general is responsible in terms of preserving existing buildings and their embodied energy. In fact, there's a slogan of the National Trust, which is, the most, uh, the most ecological building is the one that already exists.
Mm.
In some cases, that's true. In others, it's not. If it's a wastefully built building, that's not the case. But um, and the city and the state actually incentivize preservation by giving property tax reductions to people who own historic homes, because they know it does take extra expense to properly maintain an historic home. There is one example that I did not include in my presentation, and many of you may be familiar with it. It's the Sonoran Co-Housing up on Roger Road, which is a very well planned and very well developed cooperative kind of they call it intentional community. Co-housing is where people decide to live in a proximity to one another. Everyone has their own private home, but they have a common house with a shared kitchen, and pre-pandemic they would cook together frequently, and there's a whole spirit of community in co-housing. And I was not able to convince my wife to participate in co-housing because she's more of a recluse. She keeps to herself. But some of our other friends did, help create the Roger Road co-housing, which I take my students to visit. It's actually a terrific example of people together creating an environment. And they've got, it's planned for water harvesting. It's planned for a common play area that also holds rainwater. There's a straw bale house.
The common house is a straw bale building, actually.
Correct, at Sonoran Co-Housing. And then they also, with their planner, McCormick, is it Grant McCormick? Okay, who works at the U of A in the planning department. He negotiated a deal with the city where instead of having a fire loop around the whole complex of 36 homes, I think on 5 acres, they were able to add some little Y turns for fire trucks, and all the building or the houses in the back third of the lot have fire sprinklers in them. And they got out of the requirement to do a continuous fire loop. Then they took that extra land in the back of their property and turned it into a community garden and orchards, and there's chicken coops, and there's fruit trees, and there's vegetable gardens, and it is a fabulous little enclave in Tucson, the Sonoran Co-Housing, planned by some architects from Denver, I might add, Katie McCammett and Chuck Durrett, who have specialized in co-housing around the country. There's another co-housing, community out west in the Tucson Mountains, which is called Miracle. It's more of a high-end kind of, development, larger houses, more expensive materials. The Sonoran Co-Housing was built actually quite modestly. It's all frame construction, but metal roofs, water harvesting. And I have 2 good friends who live there, Racheli Guy, and then drawing a blank on her name, she gives us tours, Julie Freiberg. Julie Freiberg gives my students a fantastic tour every year. And it's a really great place, if you're part of it. And I think it creates a model for kind of sustainable infill development around Tucson. We did a bunch of Sonoran Co-Housings, It's just terrific. And I should have actually included it in my examples, but I just didn't get to that today. But I would say that's an example of a cooperative community that is actually restoring the land. There was one old adobe building on the site that they rehabbed and restored. It was a chicken farm originally back in the 30s. And so they kind of put it back into use as a chicken farm. But it's a terrific example. But I think the limitation is not everyone is willing to live in an intentional community with another 35 families. Or on the other hand, a lot of people are moving into these big retirement homes. I know my own parents did. They moved into La Posada in Green Valley, which is like a big 3-story apartment building with thousands of people living there, which is why I haven't seen them for a year. So, I mean, everything has its trade-offs, right? And, anyway, too long an answer, but I could have said it in 2 words, Sonoran Co-Housing.
Thank you. I think we're all going to go there tomorrow, so maybe we should call in advance. It's a really nice place. I went there to visit, and one of the features they have there is a rattlesnake fence. That is, there's a gate that you use to enter, and just to get through the gate, it has to clear the pavement. And so they've got some kind of a little fencing thing that goes from the bottom of the gate down to the pavement, such that the rattlesnakes won't get in. So they've thought about a lot of things there. Now,
And they're practicing permaculture, which is if you're going to plant a tree, it might as well be a fruit tree, right?
yeah. So Gigi wanted to point out that there is an assisted living complex made of straw bale on La Cañada, and that's between Ina and Orange Grove. So mark that on your map if you'd like to go and see another straw bale assisted living complex on La Cañada between Ina and Orange Grove. And then she said, how can straw bale protect from mold issues?
What so years ago, I was teaching a straw bale workshop, like really, I don't know, decades ago. It's probably closer. But anyway, this woman said to me, isn't it true that you can only build straw bale houses in dry places? And I thought about that for a minute, and I said, yes, but you can design and build dry places in most climates. And that's how I want people thinking about what they're doing. And when I suggested a couple of books about straw bale design, one is the California Straw Building Association Details book, which is really excellent. It came out 2 or 3 years ago. And the other is the Design of Straw Bale Buildings that Bruce King edited. And those 2 books go into a lot of the details. There's a lot of, we've been really fortunate over the 20 some years I've been involved with straw and natural building, to have actually had some world-class building scientists in the community of people, and really given us a lot of important insights into how you deal with moisture in buildings. And like wood and other natural materials, if they get wet and if they stay wet at a high enough temperature, for long enough, you will have problems. One of the big issues that this has been a wrestling match with code officials for years. It's finally gotten better, but code officials had a love affair for years with moisture barriers, plastic, all kinds, and basically I used to say to them, I would ask, how many of you have a failed thermopane window? Two panes of glass with water in between the 2 panes. And so I want you to think about this for a minute. This is pieces of glass separated and sealed with the highest tech materials that we can come up with, built in a factory, put into a frame to protect them, and then installed in a building. And about 20% of them fail within 10 to 12 years. How do you imagine that you could build an assembly in the field that would not get moisture in it? The issue, the problem with those windows is that it's much easier for molecules of moisture to get in between those panes of glass than it is for those water molecules to find their way back out. And this is the problem with barriers. When the moisture ends up on the wrong side of the barrier, it's not helping you. So you really have to understand how moisture gets in and how it gets out. And you need to design and build in ways that don't accumulate moisture, in the walls or in the assemblies or the materials. And I used to think when I was a young builder, I thought, well, you just have to be smarter than water. I had no idea. how smart you had to be smarter than water. Smarter than I was. But, you know, it's the fabulous thing is there are more and more really good resources that are accessible. There's one of the books that I showed is a essential building science book by Jacob Racusin, another friend of mine. It's an excellent book at whatever level. If you know nothing about building, you know, or you're a builder or a designer, it's a fabulous resource for understanding energy, you know, basically heat, moisture, air, you know, how they move, you know, what they can and can't do, how to deal with them appropriately.
Well, you just answered the question for me because we've got all kinds of double pane windows that have been failing, and I thought they were just poor quality, but it's the intelligence of water that's showing its face.
The real issue with those windows is that they heat up during the day, and if there's any leak, so the air leaks out of them, right? And then they cool off at night, which creates a negative pressure in between the glass. And so air leaks back in, and with it comes water molecules. They find their way in, but it's really hard to find their way back out. And so you essentially have this diurnal, this daily pump of air in and out. That's true for all kinds of building assemblies, actually.
That's a real, I was going to say, David, that's a real issue with historic preservation. When you have an old adobe building that's faced with cement plaster, cement stucco, that tends to trap moisture in the wall because cement does not breathe well. It actually has an affinity for moisture. It likes to hold moisture, and that can soften and eat up the adobe under the cement. So I see people all the time cementing their adobes, and I know in 5 or 10 years it's going to be falling off.
We just changed in the International Building Code, the commercial code, we just changed the requirements for permeability, vapor permeability of plasters. We actually added some range of plasters. A couple of cycles back, we took out the requirement for cement in mortar for unstabilized adobes.
That's
We've
fantastic. Because the building
been working on trying to fix the codes.
Yeah, the building code used to require you to do the wrong thing. You had to have at least 3/4 inch cement plaster if you had unstabilized adobe. So you got that corrected.
It turns out though that lime, that high lime cement stucco, that lime dramatically increases the water vapor permeability of cement plasters.
Yeah, we're using lime exclusively at San Javier for that reason, for breathability. So I was frantically searching. I found it. I was looking for, I've got a little presentation, if you have another 3 minutes, on a house I designed a few years ago outside Wilcox, where we used a rammed earth core for the living room, and then we built straw bale on the other 3 sides. So you have an insulated thermal mass. We covered the whole thing with a big agricultural shed. So the whole building is shaded. And I could flip you through it in 3 minutes if you...
Yeah, let's do.
Well,
Okay.
let's do that. And I just want to flag a few questions. Tracy has been holding on to a question, as has Paul Schwan and Stephen and Liz. So let's give them all a hearing after we look at this.
Okay. All right. Okay, so I have a client who had a high school friend who owns Wilcox Rock and Sand. So he wanted to build a rammed earth house. And we went and we visited Casa Grande together to look at the oldest rammed earth. It's 750 years old. And we went on a June day, on a Saturday. It was blazing hot. But when you stand in the shade and you're next to that earth mass, you're cool. And of course, the Hohokam built that way for centuries. The Mission is built of a burnt adobe, and these are actually little pit houses. The Ramada, this is the essential Hohokam, Tohono O'odham architecture, shade. Because if you're in the shade, even if it's sunny and hot, if you're in the shade and there's a breeze, you can be comfortable. which is why farms have loafing sheds for their livestock. So this was our architectural precedent. Oh, the hay barn. Look at this. This is, again,
Right.
now remember, hay is not straw. Hay is for horses, straw is for building.
Straws for house.
Straw is for houses, hay is for horses. Here is it. This is a hay farmer up in Casa Grande who had a little trailer for his office. He put a roof
Yeah.
over it. Yeah, shade. This is like Casa Grande.
You should wrap it with Bale.
Yep. This is, resourceful. I will say rural people are resourceful. Oh, there's my book. I'm going to zoom through that. Oh, this was a presentation I made for Southern Arizona Home Builders 5 years ago, actually. All right, here's some straw bale on the border. This is in El Paso by the Builders Without Borders, building homes for people in the shantytown. So here's straw, different sizes of bales, 2-string, 3-string bales. This is the site north of Wilcox that my client inherited. It's in a flood zone because all of Wilcox floods about 2 feet deep every 50 years. So we had to actually build a kind of a little island to put the house up on. Because again, if you're going to build with straw, you got to keep it dry. So here's a view schematically of the loafing shed over the house. So the central part of the house, the central room is rammed earth. The other walls are straw bale. And here's a view. And then here's this big canopy overhead to block the sun, but let the air move through. There's our little island and our turnaround. Rammed earth for this main room, straw bale on the other wall. So it's actually a 4-bedroom house, essentially. Carport here, laundry, kitchen, dining, living. 2-foot thick rammed earth. So this way, every room in the house touches earth and has a high thermal mass. But we leave this exposed for the winter sun. And there it is. So anyway, I'll zoom through here. Ceiling elevations. Oh, this was a little study based on SketchUp looking at sunlight on, let's see, that's the same thing. There we go. That's January, we're getting full sun. And then this would be June, we're getting full shade. So the idea is that with the correct overhang, you can get the sun when you want it and block it when you don't want it. And the theory of the house is build your high quality room, your public room, wood ceiling, really nice timber finishes. And then the rest of the house is actually more economically built with standard trusses and sheetrock. And that was our inspiration. So anyway, that was just a quick aside. Was that 3 minutes?
Something that was very beautiful.
Yeah.
And so Ryan would like us to know that Chuck Durrett is currently looking for land for a new co-housing project. So that's just for those who'd like to know. Stone Curves, Ryan mentions, is another co-housing project to keep in mind. Bob, looks like you know about that one.
I do, yeah. I find it, I find it not quite as on the same level as Sonoran. I think Sonoran achieves a very high level of integration, architecture, landscape, community. So to me, that's the most successful. Stone Curves is kind of in an unfortunate location on a curve on Stone Road or Stone Avenue. And then it feels more like a typical apartment building architecturally. It just kind of looks like another tan stucco Tucson apartment. It has a very creative wall around it, built of rebar and shotcrete concrete that looks kind of like, I'm not sure what it looks like, Gaudi or something. So there's some creativity there, but I think the scale of Sonoran and the realization of it, I think it achieves a higher level, in my opinion.
Okay. And Charles Jeffrey just wants us to know that Satori, I don't know what Satori is, but it's made of rammed earth. Maybe is it Satori the school?
Yeah, on First Avenue.
Yeah. So let's see, Trace, did you have a question now?
Well, I had a comment. There seems to be a real fundamental conflict between deciding we're going to preserve and upgrade our old homes and this idea of higher density. If we're going to keep what we've got for as long as possible, we won't be rearranging things, and scattered vacant land here and there, probably not located in places where you actually get an improvement in transportation efficiency. The thing to understand is that we need higher density is neither necessary nor sufficient to create the increases in or improvements in transportation efficiency that are assumed to go with higher density. But you can think of the two towers of Lord of the Rings as an alternative model for a city. If everybody lived in near infinite density in one building and all of your things you wanted to get to were in another building 25 miles away, your average trip length would be 4 times what Tucson's is, with the same population and infinite density. So it's not the density that produces the benefits people ascribe to it. It's the change in urban form, and you don't need higher densities in order to change the urban form. You need to persuade businesses to move closer to their customers. And that can be done without changing the density of the housing, if you assume they won't just walk there, but ride their bike. So if you change the technologies of transportation, you can achieve the benefits of ascribed to higher density without tearing everything down.
David, you're nodding your head. Do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, well, those are all, I think, really good points. And, one of the things that in the realm of looking at particularly zoning codes, I mean, we have a suburban land use code, which, mixed use, if you look at, I mean, this is one of those things people love to visit, like old European cities. And there are all these wonderful things that are illegal to do here now. Like Bob was talking about, so many of the things that, are desirable, we've kind of eliminated through the way our land use codes have been, written and developed. And that sustainable, development code framework that I was talking about has some really interesting innovations from around the country. And people have, started trying, and it divides things. It deals with transportation, it deals with energy and lots of things, urban agriculture and other things. But, the reality is we need to really have this is part of that bigger conversation that we need to have about what we need and what we want and how we get it. And, I'm not sure who the convener needs to be, that conversation, but it seems more and more clear that it needs to happen. And, I think about things that happen, like failures in planning, like what's happening right now with the zoo and with the park and with the potential to lose, the duck pond and Barnum Hill and those trees. And, I mean, my view was, why were there not big signs put up all around the park about what was planned or being considered, so that people who use the park would see it? I mean, those are the people who needed to know what was going on. And I go to that park all the time, and there was no indication ever, about what they were actually planning to do, and why. We need to develop some different ways of being in this community and communicating with each other about.
And David, I'll jump in because we got some more things coming up. But I'll just say that this is a place where a word to the wise is very well put. Anyone who's ever taught a course has benefited, or hopefully has benefited, from reading their students' evaluations. They say, by the way, this thing didn't exactly work, and then you go, oh my gosh, of course, why did I even do that? And I'll bet you just a couple people suggesting that to whoever was planning that thing wouldn't hurt for them to get that feedback. Paul Schwam had a question, which might be our big question of the evening. And then there was one other that I think we might want to get to. But Paul said, with the rapid acceleration of change, are there any new concerns that have come to the fore for either of you, Robert or David?
So when are you talking about climate change?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me just step in. I mean, obviously, the economy is going to change a lot of things. We're seeing that in tiny homes, et cetera, et cetera. People living out of their trailers, houses. There's a lot of. We got some migration patterns that are going to be coming around big time. Probably, for the next couple of decades. I made a presentation, I think, at Earth USA in a poster 2 years ago now, that I think that the Earth builders kind of have a optimistic future because geopolymers is going to start making those stronger and more durable. That's the reason why Adobe rammed Earth is kind of has a hard time in the building codes, is because they have some limitations. Well, as those limitations go away, we're going to start seeing opportunities for building with Earth, which is every day. It's not a factory item. It's kind of come, big embodied energy and the design and the work that you two guys are doing. Thank God you're guys like you out there doing that. I think I'm optimistic that there's some opportunities coming around with some problems. And just the mobile home might become, we might get pretty good at that because migration costs everything. How do we reset in the next 10 or 20 years? So I just thought I'd put that same out to you. I mean, what do you see trend wise, good and bad?
From my point of view, it's really interesting to see how many things are sort of on the verge of things that seemed impossible, or no one sort of imagined that they would come about or be accepted. They're suddenly things are in play that never were. There are other things happening at the code hearings. I was amazed to see this last time a proposed appendix for 3D printing of buildings in the building code. We're going to see a lot of stuff that, right now people are trying to work out the tiny house appendix is just for tiny houses on foundations. There's a zillion tiny houses on wheels, people that are trying to figure out, where they fit and how they can have a standard or a code or something. That's an ongoing kind of a battle actually at the moment. I think it's really important to recognize that, what's seemed like the only way to do things in so many areas is no longer the only way to do things. And it seems like things have been, in one regard, kind of tightening up. At the same time, there's sort of an explosion of new approaches and new technologies, materials, systems, and the transportation thing that Trace brought up, it is a really interesting one, because so much depends on our ability to move around, and are we going to have the ability to do that? Well, a lot's changing there too, and that includes moving around materials, to build things. And I don't know. I'd like to hear what Bob thinks.
Wow. Yeah, that's a heavy question, Paul. And thank you. And also thank you for all the interesting work you've done and your experimental building materials and developing scoria, highly insulating cinder, crete, and things. I think we're all doing our part. We're all putting our little grain of sand in, right, to try to turn things in the right direction. One of the big things we're facing, I think when you talk about migration patterns, you're talking about people moving to Tucson in droves, right? Because of the weather, extreme weather in other places. They're sitting out there freezing in a polar vortex and they go, oh, it's 75 degrees in Tucson, right? The one thing we don't have, of course, we've got sunshine, but we don't have water, right? So there's a big question mark. The other big problem, of course, is affordability. And that's one of the limitations. I mean, half of the city of Tucson, half of our population can't afford to buy a house. They're renters. And the way we do things in our society is, houses don't get built because someone needs a house, a family needs a house. Houses get built because someone can make a profit on it.
Right.
And this is something, Jody, who just left us a couple months ago. Jody, of course, was an anti-capitalist, which is a way of saying that he was a socialist. And everyone assumes that the only way we can run society is based on the way we've done it in this country. And Jody had a saying, which was, for some people, it's easier to imagine the end of all life on Earth than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. So talk about a lack of imagination, like a different way of doing things, a different way of apportioning resources and meeting people's needs. It's and the other motto, of course, is another world is possible. These are just, they're sayings, they're mottos. I do like the one that Sustainable Tucson has used, which is think globally, act locally. I think that's a really meaningful, probably the only meaningful political slogan, But we do need to imagine a different way of organizing society because it's inherently, again, unequal and, as a result, unsustainable. And that's the big challenge. Getting also to David's first quote from Dr. Jonas Salk, who I believe was who discovered the penicillin. What did he discover? Polio vaccine. Okay, gosh, that's right. It was Walter Reed who did the Anyway, so the polio vaccine. Our biggest responsibility is to be good ancestors, not to make the greatest profit in our hedge fund, right?
Yeah, one of the great things over the last decade or so through EPA, we had a bunch of contracts actually to work with Native American tribes around the country on sustainability, green building code, and those kinds of issues. And the thing that I truly love about those indigenous cultures is they're embedded in relationships and including to place, but there is this element of reverence and of honoring time frames, honoring relationships, all of them, not just honoring the creation, not just human creations, but everything. That was so refreshing, as a basis for thinking about how you go about managing, the process of creating a built environment. and of safeguarding the things that need to be safeguarded. And it's so different than the sort of reductionist, worldview that basically the world's a bunch of resources here for human exploitation. Anyway, I had really had the honor, the privilege of getting to work with a bunch of different tribes and helping them see what resources were available, not imposing our codes and standards and things on them, but saying, here are some things you can choose from, to create the systems that you need to get what you want and what you need, in your culture, in your place, with what you have and what you want.
David, that comment brings to mind a remark by the naturalist Barry Lopez in his little kind of manual called The Rediscovery of North America. It's short, it's powerful, and he said that if the European explorers had come here to learn, to listen, it would have been a different world, but instead they came to take and to exploit. And that is the fundamental sin of the current culture. And so we see the job ahead of us. Fortunately, there's a lot of creative minds. Dan has asked or made a comment. If you would like, Bob, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. When he heard the idea of getting business in every neighborhood so people don't have to travel so far to get to business, he thought, wait a minute, we have that. Those are called strip malls. Whereas I was thinking, oh, London, we go to London and there are all these villages. There's 100 villages, maybe I don't know how many 100 villages that make up London. And so what are your thoughts on?
Yeah, well, so much of Tucson was built from the 1950s on. I think something like 95% of Tucson was built post-World War II. Mm-hmm. So we have a very small percentage of our city that was built sprawl, pre the automobile culture, where if you want to get a quart of milk, you have to jump in the car and drive for 10 minutes. And if you look at the older neighborhoods of Tucson, there were markets throughout those neighborhoods, whether it was El Presidio or the Barrio or Armory Park. There were little, corner stores. And also just thinking back to, even Sam Hughes neighborhood, which was built in the 1920s. It had a market, the Rincon Market. It had a school, it had a library, it had a park. It had all the elements of a successful neighborhood, walkable, bikeable. If Tucson had been built as a series of Sam Hugheses, we would have a much more humane city than this, city that's mostly a single story high, except in the U of A and the downtown. And it's, 30 miles or 40 miles across now. Phoenix, of course, is 100 miles across and mostly one story. It's tough to turn the Titanic around, but I think you have to work in little enclaves and incrementally. I mean, I'm not one for bulldozing people's neighborhoods. I see. Mark is up to his neck, and yeah. So it's it's an interesting conundrum we find ourselves in. But there's no way out of it other than to just keep moving forward and innovating, and hoping that people will come around to see there's a better way.
That's a good story to put by.
I was also thinking about, we think of strip malls, but, the Rincon Market or Broadwayville, Jostler designed, little shopping center that, is wonderful. What's happened is that basically we've kind of allowed anything to be built. The cheaper the better, and this is what's happened to public buildings too. I was in architecture school in 1969 here at the U of A, and was driven out by, the urban removal, we called it. You could see that we were tearing down some fabulous buildings in fabulous places to build concrete monstrosities that you showed Bob. And the same is it's happened in our public architecture, and it's happened, in our commercial architecture, that there isn't a lot of really good architecture, really wonderful design. There could be, but it's, we think of strip malls, but they don't have to be like they have been.
Well, they tend to be filled with national chain stores, right? I mean, so the loss of local scale. But I know there's a pushback against that. There's a movement now for small scale development. There's a move for local farming, organic farming. Organic farming was once on its way out in this country, and there's a clamor for it now. Think of the food conspiracy on Fourth Ave. I mean, I think there's always that element of essentially alternative thinking that eventually can influence the mainstream, because those ideas do come from the fringe, right? They come from those who are thinking differently and willing to question: do we really want a Burger King on every corner? So much of this country from coast to coast looks the same, right? It's the same shopping malls, the same parking lots, the same McDonald's, the same sprawl subdivisions, and it's a shame. But again, resist the rising tide of mediocrity. Right?
Words to live by. Liz M has a quick question, I believe, and before that, there's Dan points out that something called stackhouse.life, a fascinating concept for mobile homes. For those who want to check that out, he's got the URL in the chat. And Jana points out that she's making a suggestion that we put this video on, that we post it in our meeting area of the website so people know how to find it. So there could be some information leading them to the URL. She recently did a play called Regeneration, a Tucson Story. And that's in the chat box if you'd like to check that out. A lot of creative young people working with Jana on that. Let's take Mark's question, but no, first Liz wants to know, do you know any straw bale builders here in Tucson?
Not at the moment. I've been referring people to Bill and Athena Steen in part because their sons are doing some straw bale building too. But I don't actually know. I know a couple of people who have done some straw bale building, but I don't know. I haven't been in touch with them recently to find out whether they're still doing it.
Yeah, I've noticed the enthusiasm for straw bale has somewhat diminished in the last few years. There's been a real kind of onslaught of this kind of hard-edged contemporary design, right? Of the younger generation doesn't want the warm, fuzzy, thick-walled feeling. They want a edgy, urban, loft sort of a thing. So there's a different aesthetic and there's a different clientele coming on board. I've done a couple of straw bale designs over the years. They're mainly self-built by the homeowner. They organize the bale raising. Oh, there's a terrific, you must know John Ruiz, David? Yeah. Oh, terrific guy.
Yeah, so I haven't talked to John in a long time.
Yeah, he's run a lot of straw bale raisings, including overseas. I think, even in Mongolia. He's a super capable guy. He's the kind of guy you want. Now, one of the charms of straw bale is it's like the old barn raising. You get your friends and neighbors, your uncles, your cousins, your aunts and sisters, and you put your house up in a day or so.
Yeah, we'll stack the bales. I always told people in workshops, don't waste all your friends on the wall raising. Save some of them for the plastering.
Okay, make note of that. Jana mentions Joe Sillins, S-I-L-I-N-S. So there's another referral there. Mark, let's hear your question, and then we might close out on that.
Right. It's not so much a question, but a little bit of a shift back toward the transportation questions that may have been discussed. I live out a ways, by Houghton, and maybe because of where I live, it seemed to me a year ago that the reason or the thing that would happen to most impact our transit would be the electrification vehicles, and that would certainly bring a lot of good things. But then about 6 months ago, I read this fellow arguing that the future of our society really is the future of transportation as a service, wherein you would eventually wind up with automated cars coming to pick people up to take them to where they needed to go. People would no longer need to own a car. That would greatly reduce the amount of parking needed. And eventually you could literally reconsolidate your city. And I just thought that was a fascinating idea. I don't know whether I would see that really happening, but it certainly throws open a huge door to think about.
That's
I just wanted to throw that in.
That's futuristic thinking for sure. Yeah, 100 years from now, it might be the way that people are living, but none of us will be around to see it. But if we're good ancestors, maybe our great grandchildren will be there. Certainly, if you talk to someone in the 1800s and they were riding around on their horse and buggy and the steam train was coming on, if you told them in 100 years, people will all be driving these 8-cylinder, internal combustion engines, cars, and we'll have superhighways and we'll have, atomic weapons, they would have said, "You're kidding me. No way."
Well, I would suppose things might happen a lot faster than another century.
Things are speeding up, yeah.
Yeah. So
I think
we might want to think about it, actually.
Technology is changing faster than people's consciousness, though.
Yeah. It is interesting that that's something that sort of reset my thinking about transportation a long time ago. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who said this to me, but basically he said, well, here's the problem, so you're at home and you realize you're out of bread or milk, and so you get in your 1-ton steel vehicle and you drive 2 miles to the store to buy a 1-pound loaf of bread and a half gallon of milk, and you drive then you and those 2 things back in this ton of steel. It's just like, how insane is that? And that was probably 25 or 30 years ago that somebody said that to me. And every time I get in my car, I think of that. And the other thing I think about is the need for regenerative braking systems. Think about this. Every time you start up, you overcome the inertia of rest of your vehicle. You invest all this energy, you get it moving, and then you stop. And you turn that energy into heat in the brakes of your vehicle. And then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And every time you throw away all of the energy that you invested in that momentum. Now,
fortunately, my Prius is getting 60 mpg with the regenerative braking.
Exactly. So I've been thinking, can't we invent a retrofittable regenerative braking system for cars that would get some of that back? That would save.
I'm sure we can.
Why is that not something that's happened? There are all these there are big things that could happen, should happen. I've been thinking for years that we should have, for new construction, for new houses, we should have a utility core that has all the thermodynamic elements of a house in a single unit. Your refrigerator, your air conditioning, your water heating, all of these things actually functioning in one integrated thermodynamic system. Not all the different appliances.
Buckminster Fuller invented that about 65 years ago.
Yeah, but where is it?
Right, it's not in production.
I'm working on one.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, the diamond.
That's what we want to hear. Well, I would like to call a formal adjournment to our meeting, and maybe a few people would like to stick around and keep talking. But to close, I have to say that your last comments brought to mind an old Peanuts panel with Snoopy sitting behind a desk like the lawyer. He was the lawyer this time, and someone came up and sat down, was talking about all these things, and I don't know about this and then that, and she turns and says, "What do you think?" And over Snoopy's head is this bubble that says, "Think?" question mark. And that, of course, is the trouble. Most of us aren't really thinking very much about what we're doing. Whereas you hear what Dave is talking about, he's always thinking, where is the energy coming from? Can I capture and reuse it? And I know that everyone here is doing that kind of thinking. And part of our work in Sustainable Tucson is getting other people excited to think that way too. That's what our ambassadors of sustainability are getting excited to do, and we all can be ambassadors of really living sustainably. 2 quotes to end on. Bob said, the most important factor in sustainability of a city is its built form. And that's something I think we can all keep in mind. And David said, the reality is we have to figure out how to accommodate each other. Another key principle of sustainability. We have to figure out how to accommodate each other. As the Ladakh people would say when there was a dispute and people were having trouble, they'd say, we must live together.